I found a $41 million bank account that belonged to my late husband, a man who told me for 24 years that we were barely scraping by on $2,100 a month. When I finally worked up the courage to call the bank myself, the branch manager answered with 3 words that turned my whole marriage into a stranger I'd never met. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. Everyone tells you that losing a spouse teaches you things about yourself you never wanted to learn. Nobody tells you it can also teach you things about the person you married, things so large and so carefully hidden that you start to wonder whether you ever really knew them at all. My name is Margaret Doyle. I'm 55 years old, and I live in a modest 3-bedroom house on the east side of Tulsa, Oklahoma. For 24 years, I was married to a man named Walter. He died 16 months ago from a stroke, sudden and merciless, in the parking lot of the hardware store where he'd gone to buy weather stripping for our back door. That was Walter. Even his death was practical, unremarkable, tied to some small errand around the house. We were not people with money. I want to be clear about that, because it's the foundation everything else in this story stands on. Walter worked as a warehouse supervisor for a regional freight company, and he told me, every year, almost like a ritual, exactly what he was bringing home. When we married, it was around $1,400 a month. By the time he retired at 63, it had climbed, slowly and unremarkably, to about $2,100. We clipped coupons out of habit. We drove the same 2 cars for over a decade each. When our roof started leaking in 2018, we argued for a week about whether to patch it ourselves or hire someone, and in the end Walter climbed up there himself with a tarp and a staple gun because a proper repair felt like money we didn't have. I worked as a receptionist at a dental office downtown, later moving up to office manager, a job that paid modestly but steadily. Between the 2 of us, we made it work. We were comfortable in the particular, careful way that looks like contentment to everyone on the outside but feels, if you're honest with yourself, like a permanent, quiet restraint you've simply stopped noticing. Walter was not a cold man. He was affectionate in small, consistent ways. He always scraped the ice off my windshield before his own on winter mornings. He remembered my father's birthday even after my father had been gone for a decade. He hummed off-key while he did the dishes. But he kept things close. I always assumed that was simply his temperament, the quiet, steady nature that had made me trust him in the first place. I never once imagined it was the temperament of a man keeping an enormous secret. He had a sister, Renee Doyle Sinclair, 57, married to a man named Craig Sinclair, a real estate broker in Naples, Florida. Renee and Walter spoke on the phone every single Sunday evening, a standing call that had outlasted every other habit in his life. They had an entire private language of old family jokes I was never fully let into. When Walter died, Renee flew in from Florida before I'd even finished calling the rest of the family. She stayed in my guest room for a week, and I remember being grateful for the company and only much later wondering why she'd seemed, even in the depths of what should have been shared grief, so calm. The estate itself, when it finally settled, was exactly as small as I'd expected. Walter had a simple will, leaving the house to me outright. A life insurance policy paid out $38,000, which covered the funeral and most of what we still owed on a used truck he'd bought 2 years earlier. His 401k held just under $14,000. That was it. That was the entirety of Walter Doyle's estate, as far as I understood it, for the better part of a year. I spent those months doing what widows do, closing accounts, notifying the pension office, slowly, reluctantly sorting through his belongings, a task I put off for as long as I reasonably could, because every drawer and every shirt still smelled faintly of him. It was in late spring, about 16 months after he died, that I finally worked up the nerve to clear out his workbench in the garage, the one place in the house that had always, unofficially, belonged only to him. Behind a row of old paint cans on the bottom shelf, tucked inside a rusted metal toolbox that I genuinely never once opened in 24 years of marriage, I found a manila folder, slightly warped from the garage's humidity. Inside it was a single bank statement, issued by Sterling Crest Private Bank, a name I had never heard, with a Dallas, Texas address. The account holder was listed as W. Doyle. The statement was dated 11 months before his death. The balance on that statement was $41,317,905.62. I sat down right there on the concrete garage floor. I read the number again, and then a third time, certain my eyes were rearranging the digits into something that made more sense. They weren't. My husband, who had climbed onto our roof with a staple gun rather than pay for a proper repair, had $41 million sitting in a bank account in Texas. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally stood up, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water I never drank. I sat at the kitchen table for almost an hour after that, and then, because I am the kind of woman who reaches for something practical when the world stops making sense, I picked up my phone and dialed the number printed at the top of the statement. The phone rang twice. A man's voice answered, composed and unhurried. "Sterling Crest Private Bank, this is Nathan Pierce." I gave him my name. I gave him Walter's name. I told him I'd found a statement in my late husband's belongings, and that I needed to understand what I was looking at. There was a pause on the line, not the pause of surprise, but the pause of a man carefully choosing his next words. And then Nathan Pierce said exactly 3 words that I have not stopped hearing since. He planned ahead. I felt the kitchen floor tilt beneath me, though I know, logically, it didn't move at all. 3 words, and every version of the life I thought I'd lived rearranged itself in an instant. I must have said something after that, because I remember the call lasting several more minutes. But I couldn't tell you what either of us said. What I remember clearly is hanging up the phone and standing in my kitchen in Tulsa, holding a device that had just quietly detonated everything I believed about my own marriage. Nathan Pierce had been careful, professional, and almost entirely unhelpful beyond that opening admission. He confirmed the account existed. He confirmed Walter had been the sole holder. He explained that to discuss the specifics, the account structure, any associated documents, any instructions Walter might have left, I would need to appear in person at the Dallas branch with proof of identity, Walter's death certificate, and documentation establishing my status as a surviving spouse. He was polite. He was precise. And he told me absolutely nothing about what those instructions actually said, who else might already know about them, or why my husband had spent 24 years insisting we were living paycheck to paycheck while quietly sitting on a fortune. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed Walter and I had shared for over 2 decades and stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, and I did the thing grief had temporarily let me postpone but couldn't hold off forever. I thought about the roof and the staple gun. I thought about the vacations we never took because we told ourselves we couldn't afford them. I thought about the winter my mother's furnace died and I'd called Walter in tears from her freezing kitchen, not knowing how we'd help her cover it, and he'd held my hand that night and said, "Quiet and steady. We'll figure it out, Margaret." We always do. We had scraped together $2,800 between us to help her, and it had felt like an enormous sacrifice. He had let it feel that way, and the entire time, $41 million. I got up before dawn, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, writing not a plan yet, just a list, everything I could remember that suddenly looked different in this new, terrible light. The Sunday phone calls with Renee that never seemed to end on time. The way she always seemed to know Walter's moods and decisions before I did, as though she had some private channel of information I'd never been given access to. The birthday 2 years before his death, when she'd handed us an envelope with $2,000 inside, calling it just a little something, and Walter had accepted it with a strange, flat stillness, like a man enduring an obligation rather than receiving a gift. The way Craig, her husband, always changed the subject the moment money came up at family gatherings, with the practiced skill of someone who'd been coached too. Did Renee know? I wrote that question at the top of the page and circled it 3 times, hard enough that the pen nearly tore through the paper. By sunrise, I had 2 full pages of notes and a weight in my chest sitting somewhere between grief and fury. The grief was old. It had lived in me since the day Walter died, and it wasn't going anywhere. But the fury was new. It was clean, and strangely it was useful. It had a direction. I was afraid, and I want to be honest about that. I was a 55-year-old dental office manager who had never once needed a lawyer for anything more complicated than closing on our house. I didn't have money set aside for legal fees. I didn't have connections. What I had was a legal pad, a bank statement pulled from a rusted toolbox, and 3 words ringing in my ears that I couldn't stop turning over. He planned ahead. Plan what? For whom? Renee Craig. Some arrangement carefully built to leave me, his wife, his legal next of kin, entirely outside of it. I understood that I knew almost nothing, and I understood that if I moved carelessly now, I could lose the chance to ever know more. The first decision I made that morning was, I believe, the most important one of the entire ordeal. I would not tell anyone what I'd found. Not my brother Tom in Springfield, not my next-door neighbor Alice, who was warm and generous and constitutionally unable to keep anything to herself for more than a day, and absolutely not Renee, who called me every other week to check in a voice that now sounded, in hindsight, less like concern and more like surveillance. The second decision was that I would find a lawyer, not the general practice attorney who'd handled our house closing years earlier, but someone who specifically worked in contested estates and hidden asset disputes, someone who wouldn't be impressed by a private bank's polished composure and would know exactly which questions to ask. The third decision took longer to reach, and I sat with it at that kitchen table as the gray Tulsa morning slowly turned into daylight. I would go to Dallas. I would walk into Sterling Crest Private Bank. I would sit across from Nathan Pierce and find out, in full, what my husband's instructions actually were. But I would not go there unprepared, and I would not go there alone. I opened my laptop and searched Estate Attorney Tulsa Hidden Assets Deceased Spouse. I wrote down 3 names, pulled from 2 different law firm websites that specifically mentioned probate litigation and post-death financial discovery. Then I closed the laptop, showered, and dressed in the only blazer I owned that felt serious enough for the calls I was about to make. I drove to the public library instead of using my home phone because some instinct told me I didn't want any record of these calls sitting on our shared account. The woman who walked into that library that morning wasn't someone I fully recognized yet. She was frightened. She was exhausted, having spent the entire night quietly dismantling 24 years of her own memory. But she had a legal pad full of names, and she had a plan. And that, I told myself, walking through those glass doors, would have to be enough for now. The attorney I chose was named Yolanda Reyes. Her office sat on the 3rd floor of a converted brick building near downtown Tulsa, the kind of space that communicated seriousness through simplicity rather than showmanship, law books lining one wall, a clean desk, 2 chairs that were comfortable without trying to impress anyone. She was 49, sharp-eyed, with the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had heard 1,000 impossible stories and had learned, long ago, not to let her face react to any of them. I sat across from her on a Tuesday morning and laid out everything: the bank statement, my notes, the timeline of Walter's death and modest estate, and the 3 words Nathan Pierce had said that I could not stop repeating in my head. She listened without a single interruption. When I finished, she took off her glasses, set them down with a small deliberate click, and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Doyle," she said, "you were right not to say anything to your sister-in-law yet, and you were right to come here before you go to Dallas." She explained my situation with a clarity that managed to be both calming and unsettling at once. Under Oklahoma law, as Walter's surviving spouse, I was entitled to an elective share of his estate, meaning that even if some private arrangement had attempted to leave me out entirely, I still had enforceable legal rights that arrangement couldn't simply erase. The real question, she said, was how this account had actually been structured. A trust, a named beneficiary designation, a business entity built specifically to sit outside the reach of a probate court and, by extension, outside my reach as his wife. The phrase he planned ahead, Yolanda said, tapping her pen once against the desk, tells me this account almost certainly comes with some kind of formal directive attached to it. A letter of instruction, a trust document, possibly both. We need to find out exactly which, and we need the bank to know, officially, that you're aware this account exists and that you know your rights. That same afternoon, she filed a formal spousal rights inquiry with Sterling Crest Private Bank's legal department, along with copies of Walter's death certificate and our marriage certificate. She also filed a request with the Dallas County Probate Court for a full asset disclosure order. These were not aggressive moves, she told me. They were procedural, the kind of filing that quietly puts an institution on notice that a surviving spouse understands exactly what she's entitled to ask for. It also, she added, with a careful, measured neutrality, puts anyone else with an interest in that account on notice that you know it exists. There's no version of this where that knowledge stays contained much longer. That was the moment I understood, fully, what I was setting into motion. I drove home from Yolanda's office and found 2 missed calls on my cell phone, both from Renee. I didn't call back. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the phone, half expecting it to ring again, and when it did, I let it go to voicemail. Her message was warm, practiced, entirely ordinary on its surface. Margaret, hi, it's me. Just thinking about you today. Give me a call when you get a chance. Craig says hello. She had never once, in 16 months of bi-weekly calls, mentioned Craig saying hello. I wrote that down. The following Wednesday, I drove to Dallas. I booked a single night in a modest hotel near downtown, told no one where I was actually going, and left a message for my neighbor Alice saying I was visiting an old college roommate for a few days. I brought every document Yolanda had told me to bring, organized into 2 separate folders in case one somehow went missing along the way. Sterling Crest Private Bank occupied the ground floor of a glass office tower, exactly the kind of building you'd expect from an institution that quietly managed money for people who never discussed it in public. Everything about the lobby was deliberately understated, soft lighting, low voices, expensive without ever announcing itself as such. A receptionist led me into a private conference room, and Nathan Pierce arrived almost exactly 6 minutes later. He was in his late 50s, silver at the temples, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades sitting across from difficult conversations and had long since learned to give nothing away in his expression. He shook my hand. He offered water. He sat down across from me and placed a slim document folder on the table between us. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "now that your attorney has been in touch with our legal department, I want to be straightforward with you. We've been expecting this meeting for some time. The account," he explained, "had been opened in 2004, 5 years into our marriage. It was held under a revocable trust titled the Doyle Legacy Trust. Walter had been its settler. Upon his death, the trust named 2 beneficiaries, Renee Doyle Sinclair, entitled to 55%, and Craig Sinclair, entitled to the remaining 45%. I was named nowhere in the document. I felt something cold settle into my chest as he said it. Not surprise exactly, because some part of me had already braced for this, but the particular, specific pain of hearing it confirmed out loud, in a quiet conference room, by a stranger. But then Nathan Pierce placed a second document on the table, and something in his composure shifted, just slightly, just for a moment. "There's an addendum," he said, "dated 2019. Handwritten. I believe you should read it yourself. I picked it up with hands that weren't entirely steady. The handwriting was unmistakably Walter's, the same careful, slightly slanted print he'd used on grocery lists and birthday cards for over 2 decades. It was dated in the spring of 2019, just 3 weeks after my mother's furnace had failed, 3 weeks after I had cried in her freezing kitchen while my husband quietly held $41 million in a bank 3 states away. The addendum read, "If my wife Margaret ever becomes aware of this trust, she is to be given full and complete disclosure of its contents, and the trust is to provide her with independent legal counsel at its own expense. I believe she will know exactly what to do with what she finds." I sat with that paper in my hands for a long time. Somewhere, somehow, in 2019, my husband had written a door into the very wall he'd spent our entire marriage building around me. I didn't know yet whether that made things better or worse. I didn't know whether it was guilt, or love, or some tangled combination of both that he'd never found a way to say out loud while he was alive. What I knew, sitting in that quiet conference room, was that I now had my first piece of real, undeniable evidence, and that Renee Sinclair had absolutely no idea I'd just read it. Yolanda moved quickly once I brought the addendum back to Tulsa. In her words, it was an extraordinary piece of evidence because it demonstrated that Walter himself had anticipated this exact moment and had explicitly, deliberately provided for my involvement in it. It didn't automatically override the trust's existing beneficiary designations, but it created substantial grounds for a full probate challenge, especially combined with Oklahoma's spousal elective share provisions and a compelling argument that the trust itself had been funded, at least in part, using marital assets accumulated over the course of our 24-year marriage. "We have a real case here, Margaret," she told me, "but I want you prepared for what happens next. The moment we file, this stops being quiet." She was right. Yolanda filed our formal claim in Dallas County Probate Court on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, Renee was calling my cell phone. I let it ring. By Saturday, she was calling my landline, and I let that ring too. On Sunday evening, Craig called from a number I didn't recognize, and because I hadn't recognized it, I made the mistake of answering. "Margaret!" His voice was exactly as I remembered it from every family barbecue over the years. Big, confident, the voice of a man who'd built his career convincing strangers to trust him. "We need to talk about this before it gets out of hand." "You should speak with my attorney, Craig," I said. "Your attorney?" He said the words the way you say something that personally offends you. "Margaret, we're family. Walter would be heartbroken watching you drag his memory through a courtroom over a private financial decision he made years ago." "Speak with my attorney," I repeated, and I hung up before he could say anything more. I stood in my kitchen afterward for a long moment, and I noticed, almost clinically, that my hands weren't shaking at all. I filed that observation away as something new I'd learned about myself. They showed up at my house the following Tuesday evening, both of them. Renee wore the same cream-colored coat she'd worn to Walter's funeral. Craig wore a sport coat that looked slightly too polished for a casual visit. They stood together on my front porch with the careful, rehearsed positioning of 2 people who had planned exactly what they were about to say. I opened the door but didn't invite them inside. "We're not here to fight," Renee said, her voice soft and grieving in a way that felt, even then, expertly calibrated. "Margaret, we loved Walter. We just want to honor what he built. This trust, this account, it was his private decision, and dragging it through court is going to cost everyone. Years of stress, years of legal bills. It's going to be terrible for everyone who ever loved him. What you're doing," Craig added, his voice dropping lower, "is going to force things out into the open that Walter specifically didn't want exposed. Things about where some of that money actually came from. Things that could affect you too, Margaret. Your name. Your reputation." I looked at him steadily. "Are you suggesting my husband's money was obtained illegally, Craig?" He blinked, and for just a moment the rehearsed calm slipped. "I'm saying," he said more carefully now, that some of Walter's business dealings were complicated. Private. A court process means all of that becomes public record. Then I suppose it becomes public record, I said. You already have my attorney's number. Use it. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway afterward and heard, faintly, Craig's voice carrying through the door as they walked back down my porch steps, sharp and low, not meant for me, but reaching me anyway. She's not backing down. We need to call Whitfield. Whitfield, a name I'd never heard before. I wrote it down the second I reached my kitchen table. I called Yolanda the next morning and told her everything. The phone calls, the porch visit, Craig's implication about the money's origins, the unfamiliar name. She was quiet for a moment before she spoke. The suggestion about illegal money is almost certainly a bluff, Margaret. If that account had actually been built on anything illegitimate, they'd want a courtroom even less than you would. This is meant to scare you into walking away with nothing. She told me she'd look into the name Whitfield once we had full financial disclosure through the discovery process. You did exactly the right thing, she added before we hung up. You stayed calm. You gave them nothing. And you called me immediately. I thanked her, hung up, and then did something I hadn't done in weeks. I drove out to a state park east of Tulsa, left my phone in the car, and walked a trail for nearly 2 hours in the early summer heat, thinking about nothing but Walter. Not the money, not the trust, just the man who used to hum off-key while doing dishes, and the strange, aching way I still missed him even while I was furious with him. I let myself be sad for a while. Then I drove home, made dinner, and slept properly for the first time in over a week. When I woke up, I was ready to keep going. The offer arrived by certified mail 9 days later. It came from a law firm I'd never heard of, Whitfield and Cross LLP, based in Naples, Florida. Whitfield, it turned out, was not a person Craig had been threatening me with, but a senior partner at the firm that had originally drafted the Doyle Legacy Trust and had managed its administrative affairs for nearly 2 decades. The letter was polite in the particular, unsettling way legal letters threatening you often are. It acknowledged my spousal claim. It acknowledged the 2019 addendum. And in full and final settlement of any claim I might raise, it offered me $600,000. $600,000 out of a $41 million account. I read the letter twice at my kitchen table, then photographed it and sent it to Yolanda. And then I did something that surprised even me. I laughed, not bitterly, almost with relief, because $600,000 was, and I did the math carefully, just under 1.5% of what sat in that account. It wasn't a real offer. It was a test, designed to find out exactly what kind of woman they were dealing with. I called Yolanda back within the hour. Decline it, I said. Make sure they understand I'll see them in court. She filed our formal rejection the following morning. What followed after that was a particular kind of silence I came to recognize over the following weeks. Renee stopped calling. Craig stopped calling. The certified letters stopped arriving. My front porch stayed empty on the evenings I half expected them to show up again. They were watching, calculating, conferring with Whitfield and Cross. Yolanda called this phase the waiting room. Both sides holding position, the machinery of the court quietly grinding forward, nothing left to do but hold steady and trust the process. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I needed people during this stretch in a way I hadn't expected to. I've never been someone who reaches easily for others. Walter's death had already made me more solitary than I used to be, and I'd retreated further into routine and work in the months since. But this situation was too large to carry entirely on my own, and eventually I let the weight distribute itself onto people I trusted. I called my brother Tom, 4 years older than me, living in Springfield, Missouri, working as a high school shop teacher, practical and steady and almost entirely without drama, exactly what I needed. I drove out to see him on a weekend and sat in his cluttered, welcoming kitchen and told him everything. He listened the way Yolanda listened, without a single interruption, and when I finished, He poured us both another cup of coffee and said, quietly, "That man, Margaret. That man." He said it 3 times, each time carrying a slightly different weight, and somehow those 5 words captured everything I hadn't been able to articulate to anyone for weeks. Then he asked, "What do you need from me?" What I needed turned out to be simple and practical. I needed someone who understood the whole picture and could talk through the emotional tangle of it with me. Not a therapist, though Yolanda had gently suggested that too, and she wasn't wrong to, but someone who had known Walter, who had sat at our Thanksgiving table for 2 decades, and who could hold the contradiction of him alongside me without needing me to resolve it for either of our sakes. Tom drove down to Tulsa the following weekend and spent 2 full days with me. We went through old photographs together, not out of morbid curiosity, but with the shared focus of 2 people trying to identify something that had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. We found small things. A receipt from a Dallas hotel dated years earlier from a business trip I'd never known Walter had taken. A phone number scrawled on the back of an old business card in his desk drawer, area code Dallas, no name attached. A birthday card from Renee, years old, that read in part, "Walter, you're doing the right thing for the family. Trust me. The right thing. Trust me." Tom photographed everything. Yolanda received the images by email on a Sunday night and replied within the hour with 3 words of her own. "Very good. Keep looking." In those same weeks, I made a deliberate effort to return to my ordinary life. I went back to the dental office full-time, present in a way I hadn't managed to be in the first weeks after finding that toolbox. I answered phones. I scheduled cleanings. I listened to my coworkers talk about their weekends and their kids' soccer games and the office holiday party planning. It sounds small. It wasn't small at all. There is something genuinely grounding about being useful in ways that have nothing to do with the thing quietly threatening to consume you. My coworkers knew nothing about $41 million, or the Doyle Legacy Trust, or Whitfield and Cross. They knew that I'd finally caught up on the filing backlog and that I remembered every patient's name. That was enough. That was real. I drove home from work one evening in early autumn and sat in my driveway for a moment before going inside, the neighborhood quiet, the leaves just beginning to turn. I thought, with a calm certainty that surprised me, I am going to win this. Not with bravado, with the steady confidence of a woman who had done her preparation, gathered her people, and was no longer afraid of whatever waited on the other side of a courtroom door. I went inside. I made dinner. I was ready for whatever came next. What came next arrived in October, when Renee showed up at my door alone without Craig, which I understood immediately was a deliberate strategic choice. Craig had shown his edge that summer evening on my porch, the veiled threats about the money's origins, the barely concealed hostility. He'd been too visible, too obviously a man protecting his own interests. Renee was the softer instrument, and I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that Whitfield and Cross had decided it was time to deploy her differently. She called first, asking if she could come by. She said she'd been thinking about Walter constantly, that she was struggling, that she simply wanted to sit with someone who had loved him the way she had. There was a tremor in her voice that sounded, in the moment, entirely genuine. And I want to be honest, I felt the pull of it, because here is the complicated truth about Renee that I had to keep reminding myself of throughout everything that followed. She was Walter's sister. She had loved him in her own way, whatever that way actually was. Her grief was real, even if everything surrounding it was strategic. And I had been lonely too, in the specific way widowhood makes you lonely even when you're surrounded by people. There was a version of this where 2 women who'd both lost him could simply sit together and be sad. I let her come. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon carrying a small tin of the almond cookies Walter had always loved, and I understood, even as I accepted them, exactly how calculated that gesture was. She set them on my kitchen counter, and I made tea, and we sat at the same table where I'd once sat reading a bank statement that had quietly dismantled my entire understanding of my own life. For the first 20 minutes, she was simply Renee. She told stories about Walter as a boy, ones I'd heard pieces of before but always loved hearing in full, the time he'd accidentally broken their father's fishing rod and hidden the pieces under the porch for an entire summer rather than confess, the way he used to whistle while he mowed the lawn, even as a teenager. I let myself be moved by those stories, because they were true. I let her see that I was moved, because that was true too. Then something shifted. I felt it before she said a word. A small change in her posture, the deliberate way she set her teacup down. "Margaret," she said carefully, "Walter was a complicated man. I know that's not what you want to hear right now. But he made decisions for reasons. He wasn't trying to hurt you." "I know he was complicated," I said. "The money, Renee." She stopped, composed herself. "The way he arranged things. It was never about not trusting you. It was about protecting something that existed before the two of you. Family obligations. Things he felt responsible for. Before the two of us," I said. "We married in 1999. This account was opened in 2004. We were already married, Renee." "I know, but there were considerations, understandings between us that went back further than that." "What was understood?" I asked. "Between you and Walter, exactly, that required $41 million to be hidden from me for 20 years. She looked at me steadily, something controlled and cold moving across her expression now, replacing whatever warmth had been there minutes earlier. "I think you know pursuing this in court is going to hurt everyone. His memory, the family he loved. I think," I said, "that Walter wrote a specific addendum in 2019 stating that if I ever discovered this trust, I should be given full access and independent legal counsel. That doesn't sound like a man protecting a careful family arrangement, Renee. That sounds like a man who wasn't entirely at peace with what he'd built." Her hands tightened around her teacup. "That addendum," she said quietly, "was written during a difficult stretch for Walter. He wasn't himself that year. He was perfectly himself in 2019, I said. He coached Little League that spring. He built us a new back porch with his own hands that summer. You visited us in July, and the three of us drove out to Beaver's Bend together. He was completely himself, Renee." She set the cup down with a small, controlled click. "Margaret, this is going to hurt you. The discovery process, the things that come out about Walter's business associations, it's going to change how everyone remembers him. Is that really worth it to you? For money?" I looked at her across the table, thinking of something my mother used to say. "See people clearly, not unkindly, clearly." "Renee," I said, "I was a good wife to your brother for 24 years. I trusted him completely. I believed every single thing he told me about our finances. I cried in my mother's freezing kitchen because I didn't know how we'd help her fix a furnace, while your brother sat on $41 million in a private account in Texas. I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing this because what was done to me was wrong. And because Walter himself, whatever his reasons for building that arrangement in the first place, left me a door." She stood, picking her coat up off the back of the chair. She was composed, impressively so, but I could see now exactly what that composure was costing her. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said. "I do," I said. She left the almond cookies on the counter. I closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway for a long moment. And then, unexpectedly, I shook, not from fear exactly, but from the sheer effort of having held myself that steady for that long. I sat on the bottom stair, pressed my back against the wall, and breathed. As the shaking passed, something else moved in behind it, something clean and hard and warm all at once. I wasn't going to back down. And Renee had just confirmed, through her own desperation, that she already understood that better than I'd realized. The hearing was scheduled for late January, in a Dallas County probate courtroom that was smaller and plainer than I'd imagined. No grand columns, just fluorescent light and rows of hard wooden benches, and the particular hush of a room where entire financial futures were about to be decided in careful, unhurried language. Yolanda had prepared me for weeks by that point. We went through every document repeatedly: the bank statement, the trust records, Walter's 2019 addendum, the photographs Tom and I had gathered. She walked me through what to expect if I was called to testify, how to answer without volunteering more than was asked, how to stay steady if opposing counsel tried to rattle me. "They're going to suggest you went looking for this deliberately," she warned me. "That finding the toolbox, the timing of it, all of it was calculated somehow. They're going to try to paint you as opportunistic instead of as a grieving widow who found something by accident and did everything right afterward. Don't let it land. Just tell the truth, the same way you told it to me the first day." I dressed carefully that morning. A charcoal blazer I'd bought years earlier for a conference and had rarely had occasion to wear since, my mother's small pearl earrings and my wedding ring, which I was still wearing, not entirely for sentiment, but because in a hearing about what I was owed as Walter's wife, it seemed precisely relevant. The Honorable Miriam O'Say, a compact, exacting judge in her 60s, presided over the hearing with what I would learn, over the course of that long day, was a visibly low tolerance for delayed tactics and a visibly high tolerance for detailed documentary evidence. Yolanda told me beforehand this combination favored our side. She was right. Whitfield and Cross's lead attorney, a composed man named Marcus Whitfield himself, opened by arguing that the trust's assets belonged entirely to Walter's separate business interests, structured decades ago and entirely outside the reach of any spousal claim, regardless of when the marriage began. Yolanda's response was methodical, laying out the timeline piece by piece. The trust's founding in 2004, 5 years into the marriage, the addendum in 2019, the pattern of Walter's own documented intent running consistently through both. Then she introduced the piece of evidence that changed the room's entire temperature: financial transfer records obtained through formal discovery, showing that the initial funding for a business entity called Doyle Freight Solutions, LLC, the vehicle through which Walter had quietly diverted income into the trust for nearly 2 decades, had originated in 2004 from a $22,000 withdrawal out of our joint checking account. A withdrawal I had absolutely no memory of authorizing because I hadn't. I'd been in Springfield that entire week, at my brother's wedding, with photographs and a hotel receipt to prove it. "Your Honor," Yolanda said, "this establishes that the trust's very first infusion of capital came directly from marital funds, without Mrs. Doyle's knowledge or consent. Everything that followed, 20 years of income diverted through Doyle Freight Solutions and funneled quarterly into this trust, grew from that same original, unauthorized withdrawal." Marcus Whitfield objected. Judge O'Say allowed the record in any way and asked, with the unhurried precision I'd come to associate with her by that point in the day, whether his clients could confirm the funding source themselves. He requested a brief recess. When the hearing resumed, Craig's testimony was noticeably more careful than it had been that morning. Shorter answers, longer pauses, the visible strain of a man recalculating his position in real time under oath. Renee's testimony, when it finally came, was quieter and, in its own way, more damaging. Under Yolanda's gentle but persistent questioning, she acknowledged, reluctantly, that she had known for years the trust's initial capital had come from Walter and Margaret's shared household funds, though she characterized it, unconvincingly, as something Walter always intended to make right eventually. "So it's fair to say," Yolanda said, "that you were aware for the better part of 2 decades that this trust began with money that legally belonged to both Walter and Margaret Doyle, not to Walter alone." Renee hesitated. "Yes," she finally said, "that's fair to say." I watched something shift, almost imperceptibly, in Marcus Whitfield's expression beside her, the particular stillness of an attorney who has just watched his own client concede exactly what he'd spent months trying to keep off the record. Judge O'Say told us, at the close of that long day, that she would issue a written ruling within 20 days. I walked out of that courthouse into the cold January evening beside Yolanda, my legs unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. I didn't know yet whether I had won. What I knew was that I had told the truth completely, without flinching, in a room full of people who had spent months trying to convince me I had no right to be there at all. The ruling arrived 18 days later, on a Wednesday morning. Yolanda called me at 9:20, and I remember exactly where I was standing, behind the reception desk at the dental office, mid-conversation with a patient checking in for a cleaning. "Margaret," she said, "we won." I set the phone down on the counter for a moment because I didn't fully trust my hand to keep holding it steady. Judge Osei's written ruling ran to 20 pages. Yolanda walked me through it that afternoon in her office, her glasses pushed up into her hair, a legal pad full of her own annotations spread between us. The court found that the initial capitalization of the Doyle Legacy Trust, having originated from marital joint funds without Margaret Doyle's knowledge or consent, constituted a clear misappropriation of marital assets. The subsequent 2 decades of income systematically diverted through Doyle Freight Solutions compounded that original violation. While Walter had possessed broad legal authority to make many financial decisions independently over the course of the marriage, the scope and sustained concealment of these particular transfers crossed decisively into a breach of fiduciary duty within the marriage itself. The trust, as structured, could not legally exclude me. Under Texas and applicable Oklahoma spousal rights provisions, my elective share of the marital estate, now valued with accumulated interest and investment growth at the full trust balance, amounted to $22,300,000. I sat in Yolanda's office and let that number simply exist in the room for a while, because I genuinely did not know, in that moment, what else to do with it. Marcus Whitfield filed an appeal within the allowed window, which Yolanda had already told me to expect. It was denied on procedural grounds 7 weeks later. The appellate panel found the trial court's evidentiary findings thorough and well-documented, with nothing resembling the kind of legal error that typically justifies reversal. What followed was, strangely, the slowest and least dramatic part of the entire ordeal, even though the stakes were, by every measure, the highest they'd ever been. Weeks of negotiation over the precise mechanics of the transfer, the tax structuring, the formal accounting of the trust's remaining assets, all of it grinding forward with the patient, comprehensive thoroughness of a legal system finally doing exactly what it was designed to do. Whitfield and Cross made one final attempt, offering to settle for a modest reduction in exchange for Renee and Craig waiving further appeal rights, and both sides avoiding additional litigation costs. Yolanda brought me the offer over the phone. "It's not unreasonable on its face," she said carefully. "It would save time and legal fees on both sides. But it's less than what the court already found you're entitled to. My honest recommendation is that we decline and let the ruling stand exactly as written." "Decline it," I said, without hesitating, the same way I hadn't hesitated months earlier with their $600,000 opening offer. Somewhere in that Dallas courtroom in January, I had learned precisely what my position was actually worth, and I was no longer willing to accept anything less simply because someone with more resources than me was betting that exhaustion would eventually succeed where evidence had failed. The final transfer cleared into an account under my name in early spring, $22.1 million after legal fees, with Renee and Craig retaining the remainder of the original trust, minus legal costs that Yolanda later estimated at close to $650,000 by the time everything was finished. I was standing in my own backyard in Tulsa when the notification came through on my phone, coffee in hand, my neighbor Alice's elderly beagle wandering across the fence line the way he did most mornings. I looked at the number on my banking app for a long, quiet moment. Then I called Tom. "It's done," I said. He was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment, and then he said, simply, "Margaret, you did it." I didn't cry, not in that exact moment, standing there in my ordinary backyard with an ordinary cup of coffee going cold in my hand. That would come later, alone, in the particular quiet of the house, the kind of good, releasing cry that had been waiting a long time to finally arrive. It's strange, the way a life reorganizes itself around a completely new truth. You imagine, before it happens to you, that a fortune like that changes everything all at once, in a single dramatic instant. It doesn't. It changes slowly, in layers, in 100 small decisions you only recognize as significant much later, looking back. The first thing I did was the roof. Not a tarp and a staple gun this time. A full, proper replacement, done right, by a crew I hired without once looking at the estimate before saying yes. I stood in my driveway afterward, watching the last truck pull away, and I felt something I didn't have an immediate word for. Not triumph, exactly. The particular relief of a restraint I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying, finally released. I left the dental office 6 months later, not out of any resentment for the work, which I genuinely enjoyed, but because I wanted to spend my days differently, and for the first time in my life I actually could. I worked with a financial advisor Yolanda recommended, a careful, patient woman named Denise Okafor, to build a structure that would let the money do something lasting rather than simply exist. Part of it went into a trust for my brother's grandchildren. Part of it funded a small foundation I named after my mother, covering emergency furnace and home repair costs for elderly homeowners across Tulsa County facing exactly the kind of impossible winter I'd once cried about in her kitchen. I traveled to Ireland with Tom that first autumn, something I'd talked about for 20 years and never once believed I'd actually do. I went to New Mexico alone that winter, which frightened me beforehand and turned out to be something I was genuinely good at. I still think about Walter often, the man with the secret, and the man who left me a door, existing alongside the man who scraped ice off my windshield every winter morning without ever being asked. Marriage, I've come to understand, is a living record, and mine held far more concealment and far more love than I ever knew while I was living inside it. I also went back, once, to that Dallas conference room. I called ahead and asked to meet with Nathan Pierce one final time, months after the settlement had already cleared. He received me in the same room, at the same table, and I placed a copy of Walter's 2019 addendum between us the way I had the very first time. He came in alone that day, Nathan told me when I asked. Quiet. He didn't explain himself, and I didn't ask him to. I asked whether Walter had seemed troubled, or guilty, or at peace. Nathan considered the question for a long moment before he answered. He seemed, he finally said, like a man who wanted to leave something right, even if he couldn't quite bring himself to do it while he was still standing in front of you. I thanked him, and I drove back to Tulsa with that sentence sitting quietly in my chest the entire way home. Renee and I have spoken exactly once since the ruling, a short, stiff phone call in which she informed me, without much warmth left in her voice, that she and Craig did not intend to pursue any further legal action. I don't know what remains of their life in Naples after everything the litigation cost them, and I felt, hearing that call end, no real satisfaction in any of it. I felt only distance, the clean, earned distance of a woman who had finally, properly, closed a chapter she hadn't chosen to open. I planted a young maple tree in the backyard this spring after the settlement finalized, in the corner where Walter used to keep his old workbench before I finally cleared it out for good. It's small still, barely taller than I am, and I think about that some mornings when I'm out there with my coffee, the particular, patient faith it takes to plant something you may never personally see reach its full height, trusting it will get there anyway, long after you've moved on to whatever comes next. If this story moved you, make sure you're subscribed to Kate's Fortune Stories, because there are so many more real, unbelievable journeys, just like this one, still to come. Tell me in the comments, would you have opened that toolbox or left it exactly where it was? I read every single one of them. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.